Welcome to Quantum Potential, a podcast dedicated to curiosity, discovery, and the bold new ideas shaping our future. I'm Sibel Raver, Provost of Vanderbilt University. Today, we're revisiting a selection of conversations from our first season, bringing together moments that continue to resonate and insights that remain as relevant today as when they were first shared. Throughout each season, we explore big questions with researchers, scholars, and thought leaders from across Vanderbilt and beyond. We hope these highlights inspire you to revisit these episodes or to discover them for the first time. Brian Bachman is professor of chemistry here at Vanderbilt in the Department of Chemistry. As a principal investigator of the Vanderbilt Laboratory for Biosynthetic Studies, his research is concerned with biosynthesis and discovery of natural and unnatural products. I'm fascinated by the type of work you do, specifically around this idea of biosynthesis. I think when I imagine the production of drugs, I, like many people, maybe many people in this audience, think about that as chemists in massive industrial labs, cranking away as part of what I imagine to be big pharma. I don't really think about biological organisms making drugs, other than maybe penicillin, which I have only a vague understanding of as being produced by a mold. Really, you help me to understand that drugs are produced by biological organisms on a major scale. You mentioned that active molecules serve as the foundation of an incredibly wide array of drugs. You mentioned breast cancer drug being produced by a specific species of sea sponge. Help me understand, why are bacteria or fungi or plants or other biological organisms so good at making therapeutics?
Wow, that's a great question. Many of our drugs are natural products or natural product based. Most of our antibiotics are natural product or natural product based. Household names like penicillin that you mentioned, erythromycin, tetracycline, those are all compounds made by soil bacteria, believe it or not, or in one form or another. And many, many cancer drugs, at least half of cancer drugs have their origins as natural products. And some of the most highly prescribed drugs, such as Taxol, are natural products, and they're made by plants and bacteria and fungi and all these kinds of organisms. So a natural product is synthesized inside of the organism that makes it. And it's made because it gives some kind of a survival benefit to that organism. All organisms on the planet are connected, and we communicate with each other, and we are dependent upon each other, and we antagonize, we mutualize, we cooperate, we fight. And we are in an ecological web with every organism on the planet, one way or the other. That's all a matter of scale, and we start to go down to smaller and smaller scales. And, at a microbial scale, microorganisms are competing with each other and on tiny, tiny scales, not tiny to them, And their ecosystems are like small cities with many, many players and many, many citizens, many, many components. And they're trying to find a way to succeed in those environments. Sometimes they're attacking one another. Sometimes they're just defending their potential offspring, if you will. Sometimes they're cooperating and they're working together for a common cause. And interesting thing about all these natural products, like penicillin, for instance, we do not know why it exists in nature. We have no idea what its function is in the ecology from which it's isolated, at least not yet. If you think about it, a disease is an ecosystem. When we have a bacterial infection, one of the many bacteria inside of us has decided that it wants to eat us or take advantage of us one way or another. So there's a dysfunction within our microbiome, within the collection of organisms that are us and comprise us as meta-organisms that we are. And in that sense, maybe it's not surprising that we have found the tools that organisms use in nature to combat one another. We've taken them out of context, purified them on massive scales, and then use them inside of us in order to achieve a therapeutic outcome, to manipulate a complex system in a therapeutically beneficial fashion.
Was this idea that you actually harness the bacteria or the fungi by using genomic analysis and genetic manipulation as just one set of tools to actually create, what seem like sort of Frankensteinian bacteria to make the drugs the way you want them to be made?
That's right. I mean, I started out my career in chemical synthesis, total synthesis of natural products, the art of it. And I became jealous of these organisms and their ability to make these compounds in ways. I would be toiling over a simple chemical reaction and trying to string them together to make these complex molecules. But it occurred to me, the yew tree, the Pacific yew tree, just makes Taxol by breathing in one step, right? It's a beautiful thing. And so how does that happen? There's these biosynthetic pathways that happen. You're trying to change a complex interaction of normal cells and healthy cells and cancerous cells, steer them in the right direction. So our hypothesis is that we'll take these tools that have already evolved to do that, and we'll try those. And it's turned out that's been successful, for decades.
So fascinating. Today, I'm so excited to introduce Lauren Sudial, who joined Vanderbilt Law in 2023 and who directs our Access to Justice initiative. Lauren's research focuses on how lower-income individuals navigate the legal system with or without a lawyer, and her work has been featured in top law journals like the Columbia and Harvard Law Reviews. And I love that you raise in your eviction paper this idea of multiple axes of justice, the praxis and paradox of tenants and landlords' experience of going to court and working through the different ways in which state eviction laws are applied. One of the things that was very moving to me was that the way that the laws were applied could look completely different in different courts, depending on the rurality of the court, depending on how many cases came through that particular court, and the way in which you're really addressing what people come to court hoping for. I don't know if you would like to read that wonderful section on sort of what the metrics of justice are.
In assessing the data resulting from this study, we found it important to consider multiple axes of justice against which case procedures and outcomes may be assessed. One obvious set of metrics relates to substantive outcomes. Who won and who lost? Was a monetary judgment awarded, and if so, how much? Was a writ of possession issued, and was the tenant ultimately evicted? Another set of metrics we considered in assessing the combination of quantitative and qualitative data were those relating to procedural justice. Was the process by which the outcome was reached perceived as fair? Was one party unfairly disadvantaged?
Yeah, I think that notion of was it perceived as fair versus did I win? And that idea that people might have come out of court feeling that they were fairly treated even though they lost. It speaks to such a dual lens on what the court is there to do. And in that paper, you describe the way in which judges, perhaps surprisingly, perhaps not, were open to giving people, quote unquote, their day in court, their opportunity to be heard, even if it meant that most of the time, those people in court hoping to postpone or have reduced their amount of rent owed, for example, they might not win on that front, but they might at least feel heard. Can you say a little bit more about that?
One of the most really surprising things and interesting things I think that emerged from the study was this contrast between procedural justice and substantive outcomes. So there's this really deep literature on procedural justice and the importance of people feeling like they were heard and understanding or perceiving the process as fair, in part because it affects people's view of the courts and whether they view the system as legitimate. And I think what was interesting, and this relates to, I think, a broader point about different kinds of courts, right? You already pointed out the very right point that even in a system where you have the state law applying across all these different courts, the actual outcomes can be wildly different. So you have these courts that are operating very differently, and there's a narrative, I think, around eviction court, and I think a lot of larger urban courts, that they're engaged in this mass processing of cases. So cases are flipped through one by one after another in these courts. You get very little procedural justice. And so part of what was interesting is what we saw was really counter to that narrative, right? In one case, you had a court that actually called people to make sure that the time of the hearing would work for them, set aside dedicated time for people to hear their, which is unheard of in a,
Well, no, of course, because I grew up in New York City, the idea that the court would call to check to see if you were coming, right?
Right. Or just, right, you were setting aside specific assigned hearing times. And there was a real chance for both sides, right, particularly the tenant, to tell their story. We talked to judges who really expressed this priority that people have their day in court and that people be able to tell their story. That didn't at all map onto better substantive outcomes. And part of why that is because you can give someone the opportunity to tell their story, but if they have no idea how or whether that story is relevant in the context of the law, not only might it not make a difference, but it might actually hurt them. So one example is a tenant says in response to an eviction notice, I owe rent, but I didn't pay it because I lost my job. I was in the hospital. I had to pay a hospital bill. Right? These are things that people sort of at a natural level thinking about sort of social realities.
Right.
That's how they respond.
You hear me, you see me, you understand the challenge or the plight that I face.
Right. And the court says, sure, tell us your story. They write it down. And then when it gets processed through the court says that is a legally insufficient answer, because that's not a defense under the law, and the person gets evicted without even having a hearing in court sometimes. So there's this real disconnect.
And in fact, they've admitted to non-payment, right?
Right. There's a real disconnect between, it may on some level seem to be procedural justice, but it's only sort of this half-hearted version of justice because you're really not giving people any information as to how they're supposed to use that opportunity when they are being heard.
Yeah, and that conclusion, I have to say, going into the paper was not what I expected, right? It was a surprising set of findings and conclusions that in airing one's grievances or getting a hearing, it doesn't always work out for the tenant and could lead to a worse outcome. And that this idea that informal procedures for procedural justice are not a substitute for substantive justice. Today, I'm honored to welcome our guest, General Paul M. Nakasone, a transformational leader in national security and cybersecurity. General Nakasone is a retired 4-star general who had dedicated nearly 40 years to military service, culminating as the director of the National Security Agency and commander of U.S. Cyber Command. During his time in uniform, he led some of the most consequential efforts in modern digital defense. He pioneered the now widely adopted strategy of persistent engagement, the idea of a more active approach to defending cyberspace while also strengthening public-private partnerships to defend against rapidly evolving cyber adversaries. Since retiring, General Nakasone has turned his attention to shaping the future. We're so incredibly fortunate that he came to Vanderbilt to found the Vanderbilt Institute of National Security, where he's developing the next generation of national security professionals who are fluent in both policy and technology. General Nakasone is widely regarded as one of the most foremost voices on cybersecurity, digital warfare, and leadership in an age of emerging threats. Today, I'm so honored to speak with you about all of the ways in which your leadership has really transformed the way that we think about national security. I think we often imagine war with boots on the ground, but you've really helped us to understand cybersecurity, the way that in a digital age, threats look completely different. And I'd like to get soon to the things that drove you into this field or led you into this field or inspired you into this field. But first, I thought it would be great for you to just set the stage a bit to help us understand this completely new way of thinking about threat and ways in which that might come from cyber attack rather than from necessarily people standing at a border with weapons in hand.
Yeah, it's interesting because I entered the United States Army at the end of the Cold War, and we were pretty much a thought process of national security. You're either at peace or you're at war. And over a period of time, really 10 or 15 years, whether or not it's activities in the Balkans, whether it's 9/11, whether or not it's the discovery of Russian malware in our classified systems, the definition of national security has changed. And so it's no longer just this idea of how do you form international partnerships? How do you protect your borders? How do you have a very, very powerful military? It's this idea that there are borderless challenges. Mm-hmm. We've seen this. Think about 5 years ago, we were dealing with the challenge of a global pandemic. Right. This is the world in which we live today.
Fascinating. And in that regard, it immediately makes me flash on having to do my annual cybersecurity training for Vanderbilt last night, right, at 9 p.m. it also seems to span across corporate as well as government institutions, right? We're not only thinking about cities, we're thinking about hospitals, or we're thinking about, utilities, or we're thinking about our railroads. Can you help us also understand that kind of span?
Think about, these bright lines that we once had between peace and war that now are like, this line that's between public and private, or the line that's between academic and, public corporations, or it's the line between civilian and military. These lines are getting much, much more gray. And so as we think about this, whether or not it's, being able to deal with our cybersecurity, whether or not it's thinking about the ideas of a global pandemic or even climate change, we have to think differently about this. And we have to have critical thinkers that really understand the change of what's going on. How do we bring together radical partnerships? How do we think about our competitive advantages? How do we actually, bring the power of academia to address some of these really challenging issues? I ran an agency, the National Security Agency, that has incredible technology, really fascinating tradecraft, but at the end of the day, the most important thing was talent. Let me talk about the talent, whether or not it's faculty, whether it's faculty here at Vanderbilt, whether or not it's, people from the private sector that we've been able to recruit to come in, or whether or not it's students. And interesting, we have one of our best computer science majors who shared with us the other day, every single day I go in there, I feel like I am the least capable person of them all. And, one of the things we talk about is the fact that this is exactly the power of being able to work in radical partnerships, because you learn so much from others.
Yeah.
Leaving this institution.
And what was the computer science major telling you about?
And she was just telling about working with these people that, had spent, a career looking at information technology and the way that you secure systems, and thinking about, oh my gosh, I'm just in my third year at Vanderbilt and I just had this many computer science classes.
Right.
But I think the point of it here is that, you leave an institution with that experience and that ability to have worked with people that have that type of talent. This is nothing but really goodness for you.
Yeah, who mentor you and support you and figure out with you what you want to do next.
We learn from education. We learn from, operational experiences. We learn from self-development. All of those three are really important. But I would tell you, just coming out and having seen it and done it, there's nothing that replaces it.
That's great. Thanks for listening to this episode of Quantum Potential. If this conversation resonates with you, I invite you to explore our earlier episodes. We've talked with such an incredible, wide range of experts about democracy, about technology, art, and the future of society. Today, I'm excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Craig Lindsley, a cutting-edge innovator and scientist in neuroscience drug discovery. Dr. Lindsley is a leading medicinal chemist and neuroscientist with almost 3 decades of experience in drug discovery and development across industry and academia. He's a university distinguished professor of biochemistry, chemistry, and pharmacology, and the William K. Warren Jr. Chair in Medicine and executive director of the Warren Center for Neuroscience Drug Discovery. Help me walk, the audience or help walk me through the drug discovery process. I think the extent to which I loved in reading your papers, you provide a diagram for each one of those chemical compound variants with just tiny changes in what look like changes in covalent bonds at the top of a ring, or a change in atomic structure, or a change in the way that that ring was oriented, whether it was oriented to the left or to the right. So it strikes me, as a person who doesn't know your field, that you run these large number of variants through these successive set of gates to try to determine which of those many, many keys might fit the lock. Is that the right analogy, Craig?
That's really accurate. Yes, I don't know if everyone realizes that a drug discovery program, from start to getting a compound approved by the FDA and launching and actually having it available in a pharmacy, is about a 15-year process.
Incredible.
The work we'll do in the laboratory will typically make maybe 10 to 20,000 molecules. And there's iterative rounds of chemistry, biology, drug metabolism. Because it's not just on-target potency and selectivity, but then can you ingest the molecule? Does it dissolve? Does it get into the bloodstream? Does it cross the blood-brain barrier? Does it get to the location in the brain where you need it to be? And does it do so without any kind of toxicological findings? And so
it might be helpful in one regard, but negatively consequential in another. It might actually,
So when you're doing neuroscience, we have to be really cognizant of liver toxicity, because this is long-term cardiovascular toxicity. But, it's typically 2 to 5 years in the laboratory, and then the next 10 are all under the FDA guidance for the investigational new drug enabling studies. Then phase 1, where we're in healthy volunteers, then phase 2, where you're in patients, and then phase 3, where you do a much larger multi-center trial with heterogeneous patients to make sure it works. So it's a long process, and you go from 10 to 20,000 compounds down to 1, and then still once you're in clinical development, there's about a 95% failure rate, because there's just things you can't predict, idiosyncratic toxin, other kind of things. But if you imagine from a business perspective, if you were building cars or televisions and 95% of your cars got scrapped on your assembly line, it's not a very good business model. It's very, very hard.
Very, very costly in terms of both, obviously, all the things that go into that, including many mice, as I read.
A lot of animal models.
A lot of animal models, a lot of reagents, a lot of chemistry, but also a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. So, before we can go into healthy volunteers, we have to do toxicology studies in a variety of different animal species to make sure it's safe before you go into humans. I think it's a really interesting story. I don't know if you know this one, why the FDA got started.
No.
So right after World War I, back then, there were no labels on anything. And a lot of drugs and medications just had cocaine in them and things like that. But after World War I, there was a lot of bacterial outbreaks in the U.S. from people coming back. And one company took an antibiotic that wasn't soluble, so they dissolved it in ethylene glycol, which is antifreeze, and added raspberry syrup to it, and directly went and gave it to thousands of children. And about 450 of them died immediately from renal toxicity, kidney failure.
Okay, so that was a medical advance, quote unquote, generated by a corporate entity that was completely unregulated. And
there was no regulation at all. So then they started the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, which said you have to first test this in an animal. And when they test that same formulation in animals, the animals all died. So had they done this first, you would have saved all these children. So then that led to the FDA and drug safety and drug monitoring. And so now before something moves into the clinic, it is very, very well vetted. Sure. Drug discovery is probably the greatest single example of big team science. So you have people who are subject matter experts in different areas, but then they all collaborate and integrate and just work seamlessly across the task. So the chemists make the small molecules. They synthesize them, purify them, characterize them. Then the molecular pharmacologists test them in cell-based assays. Are we potentiating the receptor we want to, or inhibiting the receptor we want to? And then they go into our drug metabolism group, which does in vitro work in cells first to see, is the compound highly bound to plasma proteins or not? Does it have stability in rat plasma? Does it get into the brain? We do in vivo studies. What's the pharmacokinetics? Is it orally bioavailable? Can you take the pill and it get to where you want it to go? And then it's just a constant feedback loop.
Right. So what you learned at that later stage, you then carry back to your chemist to say, okay, we actually need to utilize that other variant of that compound because this is yielding not quite what we hoped.
And that's why, like you see in these tables, sometimes the changes in the molecule are very, very subtle because we're just trying to fix a drug metabolism liability, a solubility liability, trying to increase exposure. And a lot of times the changes are really minute, not always really big changes to get where you need to go.
Amazing. And I guess what it leads me to realize is this incredible work that you're doing to keep me safe, right? That, when I, or anybody that I love, or anybody in our world, or anybody in our community takes, a medicine that we purchase at the pharmacy, that there's 10 to 15 to 20 to 30 years of all of that work going to ensure that that little pill is not just manufactured correctly, but that those active ingredients, those active molecules have been tested against so many different challenges that have utilized so many different hands on deck, so to speak, to ensure its safety. I'm delighted to welcome a truly visionary thinker to the podcast today, Amanda Little, writer-in-residence and a professor in the English department and the Communication of Science, Engineering, and Technology program here at Vanderbilt. Amanda is an award-winning environmental journalist and a fearless storyteller. whose work brings together science, innovation, policy, and the human experience. She's the author of The Fate of Food, What We'll Eat in a Bigger, Hotter, Smarter World, and Power Trip, the story of America's love affair with energy.
The topic of my TED Talk was the climate change is becoming a problem you can taste. Right. This is a kitchen table issue. This is something that is intrinsic to our bodies, right? It is a really important, from a storytelling standpoint, important way of sort of bringing this into a private and intimate space in the conversation. But your question was, how do I talk to stakeholders in this story? As someone who's on the outside, as someone who's not a good food producer myself, who's not a particularly gifted chef, I don't have I'm not in a Silicon Valley startup. I'm coming in as sort of a flawed consumer who's having trouble living a virtuous, vegetarian, 100% sustainable life. And I want to know, how do we build a 100% sustainable food system that is equitable and affordable and accessible, and it's not going to require us all to go live in Berkeley, California and eat $6 tomatoes, right? So I had to come to the table as someone who didn't know the answer and didn't know what that would take. And I even asked Michael Pollan and Alice Waters and some of them, how do we do this in a way that is really broad scale, large scale? Do we have to de-engineer all of industrial agriculture? Right. How do we do this on a grand scale? Yeah. And there just wasn't an answer. So when I sit down with Andy Ferguson or with one of the dozens and dozens of people I interviewed for this book, part of it was, number one, to remind myself I don't know the answer. So
humility. I'm hearing a lot of willingness to be really frank with someone about you not knowing the answer.
And to realize that I had to check a lot of my assumptions and my biases and my romantic notions of what agriculture should look like at the front door, right? Yeah. But also a real appreciation for what is essential to great journalism and what is the reason I love teaching it, especially to our students. Is that journalism is about bearing witness, knowing that everyone wants to be witnessed. Everyone wants to be understood. Everyone wants to be fairly and accurately represented. And so showing up at the apple farm, at this tiny maize farm in Kenya, at the massive robotic farm in Shanghai, showing up and bearing witness and listening with humility and knowing I don't have the answer and getting hours and hours and hours of transcript and trying to let my mind be changed as I did that, bearing witness in person.
A beautiful means by which I'm sure the people that you're speaking with feel that, right? A means by which you're communicating that level of trust, right? That you are trustworthy, that you're not going to misrepresent, that you're not out to misrepresent, that you're out to witness. It's a really profound way of framing that interview, that meeting, that encounter. And I imagine it takes a ton of time and a lot of patience and a lot of holding back where you're not actually doing a lot of the talking. Well,
thank you. It's definitely hard won. I think part of it is I've now 30 years into a journalism career, realized how many times I came into a story and whether I was willing to admit it to myself or not, wanted an outcome. I wanted there to be a good, easy answer. I just wanted it to be
a straighter shot.
A straighter shot. I wanted a silver bullet. We all do. We all want something to reassure us, especially at a time of so much disruption. And if you talk to an early journalist, they have a lot of passion and conviction. And if you talk to an older journalist, they have a lot of passion and conviction, but the more you learn, the less you realize you know. And so there is a lot of learned humility over time, and it is the advantage that any seasoned journalist has over a young one. And you learn to kind of come to terms with how little you know, even as you have expertise in the area. Journalism is great training, especially in this moment of very rapid change.
Yeah.
And because it is about adaptation, right? Like find a story, find a source, can't get to that source, pivot, find a new approach to the story. Find a way to build on sort of your previous story, your previous source, and find a new way to catch your audience if that last piece didn't hit and you didn't get it. You didn't
that wave
make
is crested.
It work.
You might not be.
It's
hitting
iterative.
The audience. Yeah.
And in the way that plant adaptation is.
Thank you to the many Vanderbilt faculty members, researchers, artists, and thought leaders whose voices and ideas are featured in this episode. Together, we are transforming higher education for the 21st century. Their curiosity, creativity, and dedication to discovery continue to inspire the conversations we share here on Quantum Potential. And thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious.